September 7th, 1978. London, Waterloo Bridge. It is a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon. Commuters are pouring across the River Thames, heads down, moving quickly through the damp English air. Among them is a 49-year-old man standing near a crowded bus stop. Suddenly, he feels a sharp, searing pain in the back of his right thigh. He spins around. A heavy-set man is bending over to pick up a dropped umbrella. The stranger mutters a brief apology in a heavy foreign accent, hails a passing taxi, and vanishes into the London traffic. Within hours, the man waiting for the bus develops a violent fever. Within 4 days, his organs begin to shut down, and he is dead. But the strangest part of this story wasn't the sudden, terrifying illness. It was the realization that a man had been assassinated in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, using a weapon so ordinary that nobody even realized it had been fired. To understand how an assassination like this was even possible, you have to understand the battleground of 1970s London. During the Cold War, the British capital wasn't just a city, it was an intelligence hub, flooded with spies, informants, and defectors fleeing the Soviet bloc. The man at the bus stop was one of those defectors. His name was Georgi Markov. Markov wasn't a spy, he was a broadcaster. Every week, he walked into the labyrinthine corridors of the BBC's Bush House, sat in front of a microphone, and broadcasted programs back into his home country of communist Bulgaria. His voice cut through the static of state censorship. He told stories of corruption, mocked the ruling elite, and stripped away the propaganda of the regime. To the British public, he was virtually unknown. To the Bulgarian government, he was a massive, humiliating threat. On this particular afternoon, Markov was simply doing what he did every day, commuting to work. Let's reconstruct exactly what happened at that bus stop. Markov was standing near the edge of the pavement, waiting for a bus to take him to the BBC. The streets were thick with pedestrians and roaring double-decker buses. He was completely exposed, yet seemingly completely safe. You cannot shoot a man in a London crowd without causing a panic. Then, the man with the umbrella approached. He stepped in close, too close. He didn't pull out a gun, he didn't draw a knife. He simply lowered the tip of his umbrella toward Markov's right leg. A momentary bump, a sharp, localized sting. When Markov spun around, the assassin wasn't running away. He was performing a perfectly natural, clumsy sequence of actions, picking up an umbrella he had supposedly dropped, turning his back, and slipping into a taxi. Markov thought nothing of it. He went to work. He showed a colleague the small red welt on his leg. He assumed it was just a strange accident. By nightfall, his temperature was soaring. When Markov was rushed to St. James Hospital, the doctors were baffled. His white blood cell count had tripled. His blood pressure was collapsing. His kidneys were failing. Markov, drifting in and out of consciousness, told the doctors something that sounded like pure Cold War paranoia. "I have been poisoned by the KGB." The medical staff didn't believe him. There were no obvious signs of poisoning, no heavy metals in his blood work, no recognizable toxins. The tiny puncture wound on his thigh looked like a simple insect bite. On September 11th, Georgi Markov died. The official cause of death was recorded as a natural heart attack brought on by a mysterious infection. But Scotland Yard knew who Markov was, and they knew his death didn't make sense. Scotland Yard's anti-terrorist branch took over. The investigation began not with spies, but with a scalpel. A specialized autopsy was ordered. The coroner carefully excised the tissue surrounding the tiny red puncture wound on Markov's right thigh. The sample was sent to Porton, the UK's highly classified chemical and biological research facility. Scientists placed the tissue under a high-powered microscope. As they pulled away the layers of flesh, they found something that didn't belong in the human body. It was a microscopic sphere. At first, investigators believed it was a piece of shrapnel, perhaps a tiny fragment of metal kicked up by a passing car. But as they cleaned the object and magnified it, the initial theory shattered. This was no accident. The object had been precision engineered. The object pulled from Markov's leg was a metallic pellet. It measured exactly 1.52 millimeters in diameter, barely the size of a pinhead. When metallurgists subjected the pellet to X-ray dispersion analysis, they discovered it was crafted from an incredibly hard, heat-resistant alloy, 90% platinum, 10% iridium. But the true revelation wasn't the material, it was the architecture. Drilled into this microscopic sphere were two perfect, intersecting hollow cavities. This wasn't a bullet, it was a delivery vehicle. The realization sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. The assassin hadn't just bumped into Markov, he had successfully injected a microscopic engineered container into his bloodstream in the middle of a busy street. To understand why someone would go to such extraordinary, complex lengths to kill a radio broadcaster, you have to understand who Markov used to be. Before he defected, Georgi Markov wasn't an enemy of the Bulgarian state. He was its golden child. He was a celebrated novelist and playwright. He moved in the highest circles of power. He was a personal favorite of Todor Zhivkov, the authoritarian leader of Bulgaria. Markov had eaten dinner with the dictator, attended closed-door meetings, and listened to the private conversations of the elite. When Markov defected, he didn't just take state secrets, he took their pride. His broadcasts weren't abstract political critiques. They were deeply personal, devastatingly accurate portrayals of the corruption and vanity of the men running the country. Zhivkov was furious. He demanded Markov be silenced. But Markov was a high-profile figure in a Western capital. A traditional hit, a shooting or a bombing, would trigger an international crisis. They needed a method that would leave no trace, untraceable to the state, allowing the assassin to walk away calmly before the victim even knew they were dead. The operation required a weapon that bordered on science fiction. Here is how they actually pulled it off. First, they needed a poison. Porton scientists determined that the tiny cavities in the pellet held exactly 0.2 milligrams of a substance. Based on Markov's symptoms, they identified the toxin as ricin, a deadly protein extracted from castor beans. There was no known antidote. But delivering the poison was the true engineering marvel. Step 1. The seal. The ricin was packed inside the tiny platinum-iridium pellet. To prevent it from leaking out before the shot, the walls were sealed with a specialized sugary wax. Step 2. The trigger. The wax was chemically formulated to melt at exactly 37.0 degrees Celsius, normal human body temperature. Once embedded in the flesh, the body's own heat would melt the wax, releasing the ricin into the bloodstream. Step 3. The weapon. They couldn't use a standard firearm. The noise and flash would draw immediate attention. So, intelligence technicians modified a standard off-the-shelf umbrella. They hollowed out the central shaft and installed a compressed gas cylinder. Step 4. The execution.
The firing mechanism was hidden in the handle. A press of a button released a burst of silent, compressed gas, propelling the microscopic pellet out of the umbrella tip, through Markov's trousers, and into his leg. It was the perfect murder weapon, silent, concealable, and deadly delayed.
But Bulgaria didn't have the technological capability to invent a weapon like this. The investigation ultimately pointed toward a much larger, darker source. The Bulgarian Secret Service, the Državna Sigurnost, had requested technical assistance from their powerful allies in Moscow. The umbrella, the pellet, and the ricin were all designed and supplied by the KGB. Specifically, they came from Camera, Lab 12, the Soviet Union's top-secret poisons and assassinations laboratory. This was no longer just the story of a murdered dissident. It was proof that the Soviet intelligence apparatus was actively operating a sophisticated assassination program on British soil, using technology that Western intelligence didn't even know existed. The brilliance of the operation meant the perpetrator had a massive head start. By the time Markov died and the pellet was discovered, the assassin was long gone. For decades, the identity of the man holding the umbrella remained a ghost story. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union that investigators managed to infiltrate the partially opened archives in Eastern Europe. They found a code name: Agent Piccadilly. Intelligence files eventually linked the codename to a Danish citizen of Italian descent named Francesco Guglino. Guglino was a small-time smuggler who had been caught by Bulgarian intelligence and coerced into working as an assassin. When interrogated years later, Guglino admitted to being in London at the time, but flatly denied the murder. Because all the physical evidence connecting him directly to the umbrella had been systematically destroyed by the collapsing communist regime, he was never charged. The assassination of Georgi Markov became one of the most infamous unsolved murders of the Cold War. It fundamentally altered how Western intelligence agencies viewed the threat of state-sponsored assassinations. The rules had changed. No longer were assassins relying on silenced pistols in dark alleys. The threat could be anyone holding anything. While what is established fact is the mechanism, the umbrella, the pellet, the ricin, investigators allege what Gugliano's precise actions on that bridge remains legally unproven. Gugliano vanished into obscurity, eventually dying in a small Austrian apartment. Todor Zhivkov was overthrown, but never faced justice for Markov's death. The umbrella itself was never found. The Markov assassination transcends the borders of the Cold War. It is a chilling study in the physics of power and paranoia. The remarkable part wasn't simply that the operation succeeded in killing a man. It was that a massive monolithic state apparatus felt so threatened by the words of a single radio broadcaster that it marshaled the resources of two nations, activated a covert biological weapons laboratory, and engineered a microscopic miracle of death, all just to silence him. It showed us that the most terrifying weapons of espionage aren't the ones that look like weapons. They are the everyday objects that fade into the background, weaponized by governments determined to maintain control at any cost. The weapon wasn't terrifying because it fired a microscopic poison. It was terrifying because it proved a government could murder you in broad daylight using something as ordinary as an umbrella.